Thank you all for being here. I would like to especially thank Tom Harrison and Jan Haywood for maintaining this fascinating platform and inviting me to share my work with you. My presentation today is entitled Reproduction, Expansionism, and the Nature-God Tension in Herodotus. This piece developed from a section of the doctoral thesis I have completed at Yale University. My thesis examines the implicit and explicit causal explanations for meteorological, biological, and geological phenomena in Herodotus, Thucydides, and Xenophon's historical works. In the biology chapter, I discussed the role of causal assumptions about the birth and death patterns of animals and plants in these historians. That chapter is the background of what I will discuss today. My talk will start with an account of why we should parse the term natural in studying Herodotus. In section 2, I will re-examine Herodotus' famous statement on divine forethought in book 3, where he notoriously talks about winged snakes. In this section, I will argue that the tension between the natural and the divine has implications for Herodotus' negative approach to the idea that might is right. In section 3, I will compare the representations of snake invasions with Persian expansionism in the histories. My argument in section 3 will be that the tension between the natural and the divine provides us a new way to conceptualize the relationship between the ethnographic and historical sections of Herodotus' work. The words nature and natural have complex meanings in English and other European languages. Their usage went through significant shifts, all the way going back to ancient Greek physis and phyo through the Roman natura, the Latin natura. Obviously, many words have convoluted histories, but perhaps none is as vexed as nature, as Brooke Holmes qualifies the term. Consider the loose usage of the adjective today. When you buy something like yogurt, it's often advertised as natural. We buy it knowing full well that the advertisers try to give the vibe of an object that spontaneously grows by itself, not contaminated by human intentions, as it were. We also know full well, we also know it must go through some kind of human intervention for the bacteria to culture the milk, even if it were made at a village or in a nomad's leather bag. Some of the ambiguity seems to arise from the indefinite boundaries between the totality of the organism that is conceived as a human animal on the one hand, and its interiors and appendages on the other. In what precise sense are the bacteria in a city dump or the neurons of a human brain part of the natural world, for example? Sometimes we use the term natural to emphasize the non-human aspect of a phenomenon. Sometimes it's mechanical, unintentional dimensions. As Giorgio Agamben shows in his book, The Open Man and Animal, the zone of indeterminacy around the human has deep political implications, a point I will return. To reduce the risk of talking past the ancient references to physis, we should distinguish between the different strands of the natural. In reading Herodotus, it is thus important to remember that he doesn't use physis in the sense of the natural world or a totality of natural phenomena. This doesn't mean that he doesn't see regularities in the world, but there are different kinds of regularities, some determined by what Herodotus expresses with the term physis. Today's assumptions about the kinds of regularities in the world do not sit well here. As Jeffrey Lloyd notes, I quote, "Regularity by itself is not enough to imply a category of nature, since many regularities belong rather to the social domain. Some of the regularities and irregularities Herodotus detects in the world make sense through juxtapositions of a mechanical, unintentional notion of physis with divine actions and chance." Already in 1977, treating Herodotus as an example of the persistence of traditional beliefs in magic and divine intervention, Lloyd wrote, what must remain in some doubt is the extent to which Herodotus saw nature as a universal principle and all natural phenomena as law-like. This is a double warning, both against attributing to Herodotus a holistic semantic field of physis, but also against retrojecting the assumption that the natural is wholly law-like. The harmonies and tensions between the natural and the divine constitute a significant conceptual dimension that undermines the holistic aspects of physis. This term is certainly not equal or reducible to a totality of law-abiding entities, as the term natural world can imply today, nor a totality of the non-human, unprocessed entities or places, as implied by the romantic legacy usage that survives in expressions like, I enjoy being out in nature. Instead, physis in Herodotus refers to a range of internal and external features that entities potentially possess and by which they are defined. It has a role in determining human events as well as non-human phenomena, as Scarlett Kingsley emphasizes in her 2024 book Herodotus and the Presocratics. Kingsley also reminds that physis in the 5th century seldom refers to nature as a uniform, rational force operating in the world, and is more often localized, attached to an object. To those of you who are interested in tracing the prehistory and the early beginnings of the holistic use of physis, I would strongly recommend Arnaud Massé's works I cite in this slide. So what exactly should we understand from Herodotus' use of physis, if not the totality of natural phenomena or non-human phenomena? Gregorios Vlastos provides a useful definition. Physis of a thing in Herodotus' Histories is that cluster of stable characteristics by which we can recognize that thing and can anticipate the limits within which it can act upon other things or be acted upon by them. Vlastos adds, from the fact that a given thing has a physis, Herodotus would not allow us to infer that we will always see it in full possession of that physis. This aspect of potentiality is not special to Herodotus, but something to keep in mind when we evaluate his use of the term. Potentiality is a crucial aspect, whether accompanied by the word physis or not, as suggested by Bozak-Schroeder in an analysis of rivers in Herodotus and Diodorus. This potentiality warrants flexible treatments of the natural, which may also be what accounts for the power of the advertiser's natural yogurt. To sum up the first section of my presentation, when analyzing Herodotus' usage of physis, or his treatment of what we tend to designate as natural, we should try to specify as much as possible whether we are referring to non-humans, intentional processes, or universal norms. As we shall now see, this parsing of the natural enables a more nuanced understanding of Herodotus' famous comments on divine forethought and animal reproduction, which is what I will discuss now. The position of the historian's generalization on divine action within Book 3 may at first seem strange. The regions that are not Achaemenid satrapies but send gifts to Darius happen to be the edges of the inhabited world for Herodotus. Passages about political, economic, geographical, biological, and theological phenomena come together in small and great, short and long logoi that integrate disparate actions into a continuous explanation of the Greek-barbarian conflict, to adopt Egbert Bakker's stylistic analysis of the histories. Part of the Persian economic and military power is taken to arise from the gifts received by the people inhabiting the edges. One of these edges is Arabia, which Herodotus claims sends the Achaemenid monarch the amazing amount of 1,000 talents of frankincense every year. Such an amount requires explanation, one that is irregular enough to be wondrous from the perspective of the Aegean Sea, but one that complies with the observable regularities in the inhabited world. Incredibly, winged snakes protect the frankincense trees, but Arabs can repel them by burning another kind of resin. The amount of harvested frankincense is even more incredible because the trees are protected by an unusually dangerous animal. It is very incredible, but not entirely so, because it still has an explanation. As he strains this delicate balance between the possible and the impossible, Herodotus makes his generalization on divine action and animal reproduction. I read from Robin Waterfield's translation. The Arabians also claim that the whole world would be overrun by these snakes if they were not liable to something similar to what I know happens to vipers too. Divine providence is wise, as one would expect, and it looks as though it has arranged things so that all timid and edible creatures produce young in large quantities, because otherwise they might be eaten into extinction, while all fierce and dangerous creatures produce young in small quantities. The subject of the last sentence is the mental quality, the mental feature of forethought, and no individual divine agent is named. Nonetheless, this is one of the most explicit cases of divine action in Herodotus, as is clear from the Pepoieke. The forethought of the divine has made the prey animals more prolific and predators less prolific. This generalization reduces the heightened incredibility of the frankincense method and harvest amounts. Herodotus thus loosens the straightened end of the incredible phenomenon by introducing the divine concern for the relative numbers and powers of animal groups. To support his generalization, he exemplifies it with the reproductive patterns of 4 animal groups: hares, lions, snakes that are dangerous to humans, and snakes that are not dangerous to humans. It is only in the case of the reproductive behaviors of winged snakes and vipers that Herodotus uses the term physis. But he does so in a way that neither takes it as an absolute nor a universal. Like the lions, the snakes that risk other groups' extinction cannot realize their natural potential. I read from Waterfield's translation. The same goes for vipers and winged Arabian snakes. If they fulfilled their natural potential, so many would be born that they would make human life impossible. This counterfactual use of physis only makes sense in a context where the divine and the natural conflict with each other, even if occasionally. But at least since Carl August Pagel, holistic readings of this well-known passage have prevailed. This passage cannot mean that natural phenomena are entirely determined by the divine, making it impossible to distinguish between the divine and the natural. Instead, the two represent autonomous, if overlapping, forces. As the verb hyparcho indicates, the counterfactual denotes an unrealized physis. The divine has not altered the nature of these two snake groups, which exists in an unrealized state. Instead, he has introduced obstacles to counterbalance it, obstacles that Herodotus explains in the next sentence. The curtailment of vipers and winged snakes corresponds to a permanent underlying clash between physis and the divine. Sure, not all Herodotus' allusions to the natural and the divine situated the two in conflict, but at 3108-109, he envisions them so. If realized, their natural growth would culminate in the two snake groups having absolute power vis-a-vis humans. Humanity has not become extinct, however. Herodotus lists the two snake groups, sexual cannibalism, viviparity, and matrophagy, as the reasons why it has not happened. The reason why human extinction has not happened. The contrast Herodotus presents between the counterfactual and the ensuing facts suggests that the divine offsets the fuses of vipers and winged snakes through somehow introducing the three reproductive habits that curtail their numbers, namely sexual cannibalism, viviparity, and matrophagy. The potentiality of fuses allows that, despite their partially unrealized fuses, the two species retain their other natural dispositions. They do not stop being fierce and dangerous. The divine overrides, but doesn't fully abolish, the underlying pattern of submissive versus assertive properties by introducing new patterns. The balance between the spatial extension and the population sizes of animal groups is not straightforward. It emerges as a result of the tension between the natural and the divine. This passage has been discussed from various angles, although the lion's share often goes to the winged snakes, whose incredible wings have entertained and worried scholars interested in the shred of truth behind Herodotus' allusions to them. Microbats, scorpions, and locusts have been usual suspects. For a moment, let us try to bridle our obsession with the wings and focus on the other protagonists. Vipers and hares were certainly familiar to Herodotus' Aegean audiences. He presents vipers as viviparous, that is, giving birth to live offspring, not eggs, like the snake fuses would supposedly require. Live birth was the basis of Greek and Latin etymologies for the name of this animal group. When we look at the four animal groups together, we see there is an underlying assumption about the numerical results of the way an animal gives birth. If you lay eggs, you produce more offspring in one go. If you give birth to a live infant, you produce less. Herodotus does not state these two assumptions explicitly, but they are clear in the way he contrasts the quality and the quantity of the reproduction and fatal, murderous habits of animal groups. He thinks that rabbits are capable of getting pregnant while already pregnant, that lion claws permanently damage their mother's ability to have other babies, and that snakes that do not endanger humans reproduce by hatching eggs, realizing their natural potential. Herodotus does not explicitly refer to the fuses of hares and harmless snakes, but from their exemplary and chiastic functions, it is obvious that he considers these behavioral patterns to be a divine repression of the animal's dispositions. Regardless of whether these statements are empirically accurate, it is vital that he presents these repeated behaviors as examples to divine intervention into animal reproduction. The rule of the game is that if you are an efficient killer, you cannot also efficiently replicate your group. And if you are an easy target, you reproduce a lot. But efficient killing and reproducing are not fully predetermined, hence the dynamism of power relations. If the divine had its own way entirely, it is unclear whether there would be any demographic variations. If the fuses of fierce animals were fully realized, it is unclear whether life could continue after the extinction of prey animals. The delicate balance between birth and death stems from the tension I have been repeating between the natural and the divine. With different assumptions about quality and quantity, modern biologists are also concerned with the relative sizes of the bodies and numbers of predator and prey populations. I will soon shortly examine the implications of Herodotus' views on power relations, but it's important to observe that political and ethical considerations are not irrelevant to modern biologists' discussions either. Biologist Paul Collingwood's book, Why Big Fierce Animals Are Rare, How the Natural World Works, for instance, caused a backlash in the 1980s because he argued that child infanticide made evolutionary sense for animal groups under certain circumstances. not excluding some human groups. The question, why do lions not fully wipe out all other groups if they are so powerful, thus has prescriptive implications about how human groups ought to behave towards other groups, whether human or not. Colin Waugh was explicit that his evolutionary ecology relied on the second law of thermodynamics by treating biomass as a unit of potential energy that is measured in calories. Biologists do not tend to consider the divine forethought as a potential generator of this natural law or presume a conflict between the natural law and another kind of force. Yet their analysis of predator-prey relations share the concern with why the powerful cannot and or should not kill the weak sometimes. Writing on some viper species relations to humans, modern zoologists even express similar observations as Herodotus, emphasizing their abundance, aggressive temperaments, and viviparity. Modern taxonomical jargon does not completely fit with Herodotus' loose nomenclature, but the point remains. Throughout the histories, Herodotus parses the relations between powerful and weak individuals and groups, spatially and temporally. Scarlett Kingsley has shown that Herodotus' narrative tests and refutes the supremacy of forces in the case of human nature. Compared to some sophists' positions, at least as represented later by Plato, Herodotus' approach leans towards a questioning of the might is right idea. This doesn't mean that his narrative is not full of sufferings imposed upon weak individuals and groups by stronger ones. But it means that in Herodotus' temporal and spatial parsing of power, the mighty also loses and does not have the normative upper hand. The lions will eat the hares easily, especially at the individual level. But when seen as conflicting groups, they do not wipe out the hares over time and across all regions of the world. Here, Herodotus' problematization of the might is right idea arises from the observation that the divine forethought has made interventions to ensure that the mighty does not become omnipotent. This notion conflicts with Plato's later representation of the sophist Callicles, for example, who uses captive lion cubs as an example to powerful individuals whose might is unjustly curbed by nomoi. In the case of our passage, it is not nomos, but the divine that refutes the supremacy of the forces of lions. In the power hierarchy presented at 310-809, every animal species risks extinction at the hands of that above it. But this pessimistic scenario does not materialize, as would be the case if the forces of the strong ruled supreme. Stronger and weaker animals continue to exist. Underdogs occasionally defeat fiercer opponents in unexpected ways. In explaining why fierce animals do not have absolute power, Herodotus' pitting of the natural against the divine problematizes, I argue, the right to rule by those who are by nature more powerful than others. The fact that the nature-God tension does not result in equal populations matches the unstable magnitude of cities as in Herodotus' programmatic statement on fluctuation at the beginning of Book 1. Power is treated as a relative factor in 310-809 too. Humans are presented as stronger than rabbits, but weaker than vipers and winged snakes. The divine concern with the continued existence of the weak alongside the strong is a principle that applies on a case-by-case basis. The divine is concerned about humans vis-a-vis the two dangerous snake groups, but the principle is not anthropocentric. As Herodotus indicates that it also applies to relations between rabbits and lions and birds of prey. Against humans, the divine protects rabbits. Against certain snakes, humans. The use of panda at 31082 suggests that the principle dynamically applies to all living beings. The question then is whether divine intervention into animal reproduction says something about power relations among humans. Scholars have observed that the divine intervention in animal reproduction bears similarities to parts of Herodotus' depiction of Xerxes' Greek campaign and various references to divine jealousy in the histories. What I hope to have shown is that the tension between the natural and the divine inflects the dynamism of power relations. I argue that this tension is a tool for Herodotus to conceptualize his anti-growth message. The fact that Artabanus' warnings against Xerxes' maximalist expansion turn out prophetic shows that Herodotus structures his narrative against unbridled expansion. The message is not against all growth, but the drive to maximize the power of one individual or group at the expense of others. That is, when expansion of one part risks the existence of all. In Artabanus' famous generalization on divine jealousy, an unnamed deity hurls his bolts always at the greatest buildings and the tallest trees. Although Artabanus does not explicitly use fuses, he has the divine curtail the growth of large animals and trees, like at 3108. Even a large army is thus destroyed by a small army, he says. Artabanus has recourse to the natural when he associates Xerxes' expansionist urge with a turbulent sea, whose fuses is curbed by the winds, at 716a alpha. As is well known, later events in both land and sea show that these are not mere metaphors. Paraphrasing Tom Harrison's point on the historian's belief in retribution, we can assert that the nature-God tension is part of an attitude of mind that has shaped and been shaped by the events that Herodotus records. In the remaining part of my presentation, I will trace implicit examples of this tension in other references to snake invasions. My argument here is that even in implicit and divergent ways, the nature-God tension is a shared element in the ethnographic and historical sections of Herodotus' work. This shared element is not entirely implicit, and we can occasionally detect it in the verbal echoes in Herodotus' references to the spatial expansion of snakes and the Persians. Rosaria Manson describes this kind of parallelism thus: similarities among different actions, their motives, and their outcomes may emerge from the recurrence of words and concepts within different contexts. As I discussed in the previous section of this talk, Herodotus' counterfactual about vipers and winged snakes conveys a vivid image of one group of entities filling the earth. This image is reiterated in his various allusions to the growth of Persian power. The similarity arises from the Persians being the expansionist group par excellence in large chunks of Herodotus' narrative. While it is certainly true that his representation of the Persians is complex and not always negative, his depiction of the dynamics of Persian expansion displays remarkable parallels with that of the growth of snake populations. In the histories, snakes are identified at least once with the Lydians in a way that highlights Lydian autochthony as opposed to the Persians. In what Herodotus confirms to be a portent, when snakes infest an area at Sardis, horses eat them, temporarily abandoning their normal diet. The growth of snake numbers here results in the invasion of space, and the decline of a group happens by being eaten by another group, as at 3108. That passage resonates here through the verbs empimplemi and katestio. The Lydian snake equation connotes power dynamics. The Lydians are the region's strongest group at this time. At 179, Herodotus states that at this time in Asia there was no ethnos more manly or warlike than the Lydian. This power typically leads to excessive growth, and the Lydian king Croesus desires expansion. Growing at the expense of the other groups in the region, he crosses the Hellas and attacks Cyrus. When the Persians counterattack, the Lydians are not afraid, they loy. 180, a term we have seen in Herodotus' generalization at 3108. Cyrus can defeat the Lydians only with a trick that relies on the natural disposition of horses. After Croesus' great empire is destroyed, the Lydians lose their assertiveness and are pacified following Croesus' advice. In a way, Croesus' Lydians resemble the later Persians. The Persian kings fill up whole swathes of territory. When Darius becomes king, thanks to another horse trick at the Proastion and divine thunder, everyone in Asia except the Arabs were Darius subjects because Cyrus and then Cambyses subdued them. Darius uses marriage as a means to curb the growth of competing lineages. When these lineages pass under his control, we are told that everything was full of his power. Herodotus' figurative use of fullness evokes an image of Asia entirely under Darius' control. Obviously, the Persian king and his soldiers do not fill the entire space of Asia, nor can they possibly control everything happening there. The image rather emphasizes the absolute power that Darius has supposedly acquired. Even if exaggerated, Herodotus' holistic language insinuates that no room is left in Asia for the growth of another power. He conveys absolute power with the same verb he uses for snakes' world domination at 3108. This would not imply that the Persian control of Asia is completely against divine forethought. Part of Darius' expansion in Asia appears to have divine sanction. For example, his capture of Babylon, which Herodotus qualifies as fated, morsimon, at 3154. This nuance contributes to the idea that Herodotus does not problematize Persian or snake expansion unless they target the entire earth. A desire for infinite growth later makes an appearance among Xerxes' aspirations, in which he implicitly uses the metaphor of filling up space. We will show that the Persian land is bordering Zeus's realm, because the sun will certainly not gaze upon any land that is bordering ours. But together with you, I will traverse all of Europe and put all lands into one land. Had it been fully realized, this drive to maximize growth would have disturbed the hierarchy between mortal and immortal realms by making Xerxes Zeus's neighbor. It triggers Artabanus' warning about the dangers of incurring divine jealousy by growing too much, which I have discussed earlier. Xerxes' desire for limitless growth is accompanied by a blatant lack of justice too, emphasizing that no one will be left hypoleipestai to oppose him. The king adds that after his conquest of Europe, not only those who have wronged the Persians, i.e. Athens and Eretria, but also innocent people will become their slaves. Herodotus presents Cyrus's control of Asia differently from Xerxes' control of the whole world, as we can tell from certain dream episodes. Before the Greek expedition, Xerxes dreams that the branches of his olive reed occupy the entire earth, but then the reed disappears from his head. The Magi interpret the dream to mean that he will seize hold of the entire earth and enslave all humans for himself. This dream has important differences to Astyages' dreams signaling Cyrus's domination of Asia. Astyages dreams that his daughter urinates so much that it fills his city and floods all Asia, and that a vine grows from his daughter's genitals, and the vine covers all Asia. In Cyrus's case, the whole of Asia, not the entire earth, is at stake, while in Xerxes' dream, the olive reed, which covers the entire earth, disappears, evoking Artabanus' jealous god who doesn't let others show themselves. Phantasestai. In the ensuing narrative, the Persians hold only parts of Europe and some only temporarily. Xerxes' invading army fills up space in memorable ways. After finally crossing the Hellespont, Xerxes sits on a throne on a hill, and looking down at the shore, he watches his infantry and ships. He sees the entire Hellespont covered by his ships, and all the shores and fields of the Abydonians full of his men. The use of epipleia, full of cognate with pimplemi, stresses the maximization entailed in Persian expansion as at 3108 and 388. It is perhaps not the entirety of Europe that is literally filled by Xerxes, but in a given area of Europe, his army fills the whole space he can see around him. In his elation, he is reminded of his mortality, the ultimate curbing of human growth. He weeps and has a Solonian conversation with Artabanus. Watching from high on his throne at the Hellespont, Xerxes also desires to see his ships compete in their lower position, not unlike the ecologist god of 3108, who surveys competing animal groups. His vantage point places him above the competition among the supposedly inferior men below. The height difference, which is repeated elsewhere, ominously presents Xerxes in a godlike position, which is also the impression he gives to the local Hellespontines. Admittedly, Herodotus does not present Xerxes as a one-dimensional villain, as shown, for example, by his respect for Zeus while crossing the Hellespont and other gestures of piety. Still, despite his relatively positive aspects, Xerxes' maximalist approach to growth presents a threat to God's absolute power. The king and his magi typically overlook God's negative evaluation of their expansion, misreading bad omens, like the solar eclipse at the Hellespont. Later in Book 7, Persian arrows are imagined as hiding the sun, almost imitating an eclipse. The repetition of the verb apokrypto in this passage and the one you see in the slide at the crossing of the before the crossing of the Hellespont evokes the ships covering at the repetition of the verb apokrypto evokes the ships covering the sea at 7:45, which is in the slide you see on the screen. The image reflects the huge size of the Persian army. This expression of Persian spatial expansion chimes with Xerxes' plan to establish his border with Zeus's Ether, at which point he will control all the land under the sun. In Herodotus' snake invasions, we find similar expressions of spatial expansion that implicitly echo the tension we examined at 3108-109. In his account of the sacred animals of Egypt, winged snakes repeatedly try and fail to conquer the country. In the spring, winged snakes from Arabia fly to Egypt. The ibises encounter them at the entrance of this land, the ibis birds, and do not let them pass, but kill them. Herodotus refers to this seasonally recurring attack as a military campaign. We are not given the reasons behind the expedition. Its seasonal nature dovetails with a predictability based on snake fuses. Their natural expansionist tendency, as we saw earlier, is denoted by the counterfactual that they would fill the earth unless God stymied their fuses. One similarity between this snake campaign and Xerxes' Greek expedition arises from the location of the battle, which bears a significant resemblance to Thermopylae, as Catherine Clark has emphasized. Herodotus locates the snake ibis war at a pass near the town of Buto, at the northeast of the Nile Delta. Buto, modern Tel El Farain, is about 60 kilometers away from Pelusium, which Herodotus describes as the first town one reaches after using the only feasible land entrance into Egypt. The historian indicates that he went to the pass near Buto to inquire about the winged snakes, where he saw snake bones of indescribable quantity. The entrance into Egypt, where the ibis birds fight the snakes, happens to be a narrow mountain pass opening to a great plain. And this plain borders on the Egyptian plain. Herodotus later stresses the narrowness of the mountain pass at Thermopylae several times in his account of Xerxes' attack on the sole land entrance into Greece. The historian's reason for describing the past near Buto is presumably to locate the snake bones he claims to have inspected in situ, anticipating objection. That this was supposed to be an air battle throws into relief his description. Dead flying snakes would fall somewhere, but why a mountain pass, as if the flying invaders had to walk into the land? My point is not whether Herodotus is lying or not, but what such details tell us about the parallels between his treatment of snake infestation and Persian expansion. The ostensibly trivial image of the narrow mountain pass would certainly evoke Thermopylae for a generation of Greeks, very familiar with Leonidas and his 300 Spartans. A small group of men stopped Xerxes' large army, while the ibis, which a later Greek source describes as slow-moving, stops the fierce winged snakes every spring. The underlying idea of the scenes at both Buto and Thermopylae is the curbing of the excessive growth of a mighty attacker defeated by an underdog. The snakes' invasion of Egypt would result in the extinction of Egyptians, since we learn at 3109 that these winged snakes would make life unlivable for humans. It's difficult to say for sure whether Herodotus or his sources envisioned the ibis snake battle as subject to divine intervention like the Persian Wars, but this seems probable. The context is certainly sacred, since the historian introduces the snake-ibis battle as an etiological account to explain why the ibis is sacred. It is because of this ergon, namely the prevention of the snake invasion, that Egyptians greatly honor the black-crested ibis. The idea that all animals in Egypt are sacred could be lurking behind the effort to stop the winged snakes, whose reproduction we know the divine forethought restrains. The sacred ibis is the Egyptian god Thoth's animal, but as is well known, Herodotus tries to avoid divine details. At the very least, we can say that the hindering of the snake invasion accords with Herodotus' view of divine action at 3108-109. Herodotus does not vouch for this snake-ibis battle as he does for the Sardis portents at 178 and the Arab account of winged snakes at 3108. Still, he asserts that both Egyptians and Arabs agree on the snake-ibis war, providing additional support apart from the snake remains he claims to have seen with his own eyes. His autopsy at the mountain pass is full of unexpected detail, listing both Ostea and Acanthus, and at 275 he lingers on the magnitudes of bone heaps, perhaps in an effort to forestall disbelief. There were large, somewhat smaller, and much smaller heaps. The scene Herodotus conjures at the pass near Buto almost evokes a war memorial. It resembles the other skeleton autopsy he conducts on a battlefield, namely his notorious observation of the skulls of the Egyptians and Persians who died at the Battle of Pelusium, after which Cambyses invaded Egypt. The battlefield, or wherever the human skeletons were placed, must be in the vicinity of Pelusium. As with the winged snake remains, this information combines autopsy and local knowledge. The human bones are heaped, perikehumenon, like the snake bones that are katakehuatai. This shared image of heaped bones is nevertheless striking. So is the closeness of the two locations. If Alan Lloyd's positioning of this mountain pass near Tel el-Dafana is true, then the heaps of snake remains and the Persian and Egyptian remains were not far from each other. Herodotus refers to Tel el-Dafana as Daphne of Pelusium, indicating its proximity to Pelusium. The same local guide could well have informed him of Cambyses' invasion and the winged snake attack. The historians' accounts of the siege of Sardis and the Battle of Pelusium both include elements with implicit connections to divinity, like the portent Teras of snake-eating horses before the Persian expansion into Lydia. The great portent, Phasma Megiston, of rain at Thebes, precedes the Persian invasion of Egypt. In both cases, natural patterns are disrupted by an unidentified power. At Pelusium, divine action evokes animal habits in another battle reported by Herodotus. A deity, presumably Hephaestus, intervenes to help the weaker army by changing the consumption habits of mice. This is in Book 2, 141. When the priest of Hephaestus, Ptah, ruled Egypt, Sennacherib's large army of Arabs and Assyrians attacked Egypt. But Egyptian soldiers refused to fight. An unnamed god tells the Egyptian king not to worry in his dream, and before the Assyrian army attacks Egyptian civilians at Pelusium, field mice eat the enemy's weapons, thus causing their defeat. Here too, the underdog wins when a god intervenes in what are commonly perceived as natural patterns. The invasion of the Nuri land by snakes also exhibits verbal parallels with the language Herodotus uses to describe Persian expansion. Describing the human groups neighboring Scythia, Herodotus mentions the Nuri, who may be sorcerers because they become wolves for a few days once a year, as reported from two sources. Snakes invaded the Nuri country a generation before Darius unsuccessfully invaded Scythia. One generation before Darius' campaign, it happened that the Nuri left their whole land because of snakes. Because their land made many snakes appear, and more snakes attacked from the desert areas to the north. The Nuri were pressed to such an extent that they left their own land and settled at the Budini. This example fits well with the situation described at 3109, namely snakes filling an entire area and making it unlivable for humans, pressing them to leave. Herodotus relates the snake invasion chronologically to that of Darius a generation later, thus placing it on a continuum with human actions. The snake invasion in the land of the Nuri occurs because their land makes snakes appear, anephine. Herodotus uses this verb in various passages where divine intervention is implicit or explicit. Part of God's great revenge, ektheu nemesis megale, on Croesus, is a great boar, a large boar that emerged, anephane, from Mount Olympus in Mysia, and indirectly caused the death of his son. The same verb is used to express the rising of the river Diras to save Heracles from fire in a fashion that negatively reminds the Scamander River in Iliad Book 21. Homer and Pindar use the verb in oracular and ominous contexts. In the Memorabilia, Xenophon writes that the gods revealed anephenon, stars at night. Herodotus' word choice, then, combined with his observations on God's interest in snake reproduction at 3109, implies an underlying ominous aspect, especially given that the event is temporally related to Darius' invasion. When Darius attacks, instead of fighting him, the Nuri flee back to their country, which is presumably no longer snake infested. The verb ekleipo, which Herodotus employs twice in the Nuri snake invasion episode, evokes the language he uses in expressing God's purpose, expressing the purpose of the divine forethought in counteracting physis. Recall that at 31082, divine forethought has reduced predators' fertility and made their prey more productive so that they will not go extinct, epilipe, by being eaten. Recall also that Xerxes expects no one will be left, hypolepe style, to oppose him after his conquest of Europe. Most strikingly, the image of extinguishing emerges in the repeated exhaustion of rivers by Xerxes' army. This is precisely the fate the divine forethought wants to avoid for weaker animal groups. In Herodotus' hyperbolic accounts of water consumption, he uses the verb epileipo 4 times. This depiction of expansion has the invading army fill up the space of Europe while eliminating its component parts. A parallel image of evacuation by filling recurs when the Greeks in Thrace have to feed Xerxes' army. Even though the soldiers are full, they leave no movable object behind them. Here, it is not space they fill, but themselves, which literally empties the space that they are passing through. Unlike the rivers pressed by Xerxes and the Nuri pressed by snakes, the Athenians do not leave Greece, eklipein tenellada, although they briefly evacuate Athens. Herodotus is explicit that they are able to do this together with their gods, metagetheus. The verbal echoes between episodes of snake infestation and Persian expansion show that for Herodotus, the tension between the natural and the divine underlies both human and non-human behaviors, and therefore is a common motive to both historical and ethnographic sections of his work. In conclusion, these verbal parallels suggest that the God-nature tension helps Herodotus express a critique of the drive for maximum growth, the underlying tension between Physis and the divine that he presents at 3108-109 has relevance for the power dynamics among human groups. The common imagery he uses to depict the spatial expansion of snake populations and the Persians, and the implicit assumptions about divine intervention that we detect in these depictions reveals that his view of the nature-God tension impacts both his ethnographic and historical statements. The connections between reproduction and expansionism I have explored rely on Herodotus' dynamic treatments of the natural and the divine. The divine only partially curbs the natural expansion of mortals. Instead of equating the natural with the divine, or the complete dominance of one over the other, we find a dynamism that leaves room for temporal and spatial variations of powers and capacities. For Herodotus, the divine is not inherently against the growth of either snakes or Persians, but acts only when they endanger the existence of others by filling the space which other groups inhabit. His framing of divine intervention against nature leaves room for an irreducible element in the fiercest of things, namely their potential for growth. This juxtaposition of natural dispositions with the divine generates a dynamic of growth and decline that applies not only to humans, but to all mortal creatures. As a result, the view that Herodotus sees balance in the world should be qualified with the assertion that he recognizes shifting patterns in moments of order and disorder. Balance appears when one looks at the world as a whole. As soon as one focuses on a particular temporal or spatial segment of the world, one finds asymmetry and reciprocal attempts at encroachment. This dynamic view accounts for the episodes of oppression and cruelty, the individuals who remain unavenged within their lifetimes, and the conditions that generate victorious underdogs in the histories. Thank you for listening.